Kyle Tierman here. I'm in Cape Town.
I was the only journalist in northern Nigeria.
Not an adventure until you get lost in Tijuana.
If you get caught inside by a giant wave, you feel really alone.
I love the adventure of waking up and not knowing what will happen and that being my job.
All right. Nina Simon on the mic.
Kyle Tierman.
Not to be mistaken for Nina Simone, which I'm sure many people who Google your name first come across a wonderful singer who is not you.
It's actually one of the best, I feel like being named after somebody incredible is one of the best free gifts you can have. Because I'll be at a toll booth or anywhere you need to show your ID and people just light up.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's
yeah.
as if they know me and they definitely don't.
It's a really positive connotation,
Yes,
too. Yeah.
And it's free. Yeah.
You don't want to be like, I'm Adolf Hitler.
Yeah,
You're like, damn it, I don't like him already. Well, I'm so happy to finally be sitting down with you. I've known about you for a long time. I think we did a TEDx talk the same year, many moons ago. And we're going to get into all of your wonderful accomplishments in this conversation. But I wanted to start in maybe a less expected place, which is Santa Cruz Movement.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about what Santa Cruz Movement is.
Okay, Santa Cruz Movement is a movement studio in Santa Cruz, California that we're super lucky to have in our small town because the owners, Dean and Leela, are two of the very few licensed practitioners of Ido Portal's approach to natural movement. And it's basically a place where you go and every time you go, you're doing something entirely different. And in fact, it's pretty common that in 75 minutes, it's you're juggling, you're doing handstands, you're doing crazy pull-ups, but then you're also doing something kind of dancey. And I think that for me, as somebody who's been a lifelong athlete, I never got into stretching or I always thought yoga was both annoying and hard.
Yeah.
And I'm also a little ADD about wanting to try new things and not wanting to do the same regimen. And so to me, Santa Cruz Movement, their whole philosophy is instead of just training one movement continuously where if you fall out of that, you're going to get injured, train to be able to do the weird things, to do the roll, to, jump on that swing, whatever it is. And I feel like as somebody who wants to keep playing hard as I get older, I'm never going to go to yoga. I'm not going to Pilates, but I'll do this and I freaking love it.
I had the misfortune of getting really into skateboarding when I was younger, and as a result of snapped my wrists. Count them 4 times now.
Yeah, I can see.
Yeah, you can see, both sides.
Yeah.
And great fun. Love the sport, but spent a lot of time in physical therapy offices. And I remember the first time I went into Santa Cruz Movement with some friends. Almost looks like a little circus camp at first with all the stuff they have you doing. But I remember halfway through the first session thinking, oh, this is a really good physical therapy class.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for people who want to do more intense workouts, this is how you can do all of those things longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say while I'm super proud of being able to hold a handstand for a minute and a variety of things, the thing that Santa Cruz Movement has done for me that I'm most thrilled about is my whole adult life I was 5'3". And then last year I went with my kid down to my parents, we're measuring her against the wall as you do. Measure me too. I'm 5'4.5". I called my husband. I was like, I grew 1.5 inches. He's like, no, you didn't. And he showed up the next day with a level and he's like, okay. And I think as somebody who had never done flexibility stuff, had never done hanging work. Wow. I really think that there was extra room in my spine. And as somebody who plays beach volleyball, it's you want every freaking inch, especially when you're short.
Yeah, you're going to start spiking those balls now.
My goal now is 5'9" by 50, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Man, quite a marketing strategy for these guys. We'll make you taller.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And you said you've been an athlete your whole life. what's your relationship to physical movement and ideas?
What a great question. Well, like a lot of people, I use movement to both get closer to ideas and to get away from them, right? So sometimes it's like you're so in your head working, it's like, I got to just go for a run or I got to go for a swim. And then there's sometimes where it's like, I can't quite figure this out. I need to experience and sort of explore it in my body in a different way. And so I feel like I do both of those, but I have to admit that the thing I love most is playing team sports. And when I'm going out, like this morning, I was playing beach volleyball. I am not thinking about plot points in the book I'm writing. I'm just experiencing the joy and the intensity of being in my body. But what I will say is I've really noticed that taking on a new creative or a hard mental activity, I notice how, and I'm curious if this is true for you, the ways I've been taught to train in sports are so useful in those spaces as well. Because like when you learn a new sport, you're awkward, you don't know what you're doing, but you know that you just have to put in the reps. And you know that some days you're going to go out and you're going to have a shitty day, and some days you're going to go out and have a great day. And I like to similarly, as a writer, when I now sit down, I like to think, okay, how can I approach this the way I'd approach a day of volleyball, where it's like, I'm just going to try these exercises again and again if I don't know how to go on the main project I'm working on, or I'm going to feel good about, shitty writing if I'm working on the thing I said I wanted to work on. And I feel like so many of those skills around resilience and learning something new through repetition and through experimentation for me really came from what I learned in playing sports.
I often say, and it might be the primary metaphor of my life, that athletics is a one-to-one to creativity. Like it is the most direct metaphor to creativity that I've been able to find. First of all, because most times I go to work out, I'm not particularly psyched to do it beforehand. Sometimes there are days with writing where I'm just amped, but a lot of times it feels like feels to start a workout, which is I don't really want to do this, so I'm gonna trick myself into it, whether it be, okay, I'm gonna go for a run in the morning, I'm gonna put my running shoes out at the bottom of my bed, so it forces me to make that easier. With writing, I often have a timer, and I'll just keep, okay, I'm gonna sit down for 1 hour, and no matter what happens, I'm just gonna do that. It doesn't necessarily need to be a great writing session, doesn't necessarily need to be a great workout, but I'm just gonna do it. And I think that it in both disciplines and inure you to discomfort a bit.
Yes, absolutely. And make you believe that it's worthwhile to sit in the discomfort and that there's something on the other side of that.
Yes. Yeah. And it just normalizes it, right? So I think that people who don't do hard workouts often can get in their heads when the words aren't coming, and then that gives way to this whole story of writer's block, or I can't it's like, but if you just have a bad workout, it's like, great, I'm going to show up again tomorrow, and it allows you to move through those hard feelings a little bit easier.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's interesting though, I know you work in the creative industry more on the commercial side. I've spent most of my life working in the nonprofit arts, and at least in nonprofit arts, there's a real allergy to sports. And I think a lot of that's because people who work, for example, I spent a lot of time working in museums, might have been people who didn't play sports, they were nerds in school, they were not, or they were artsy. And it's always been surprising to me because I similarly feel that there's such a connection between these things, or even just, getting in your head about something and just turning upside down for a minute or doing some push-ups and get your blood moving in a different way. For me, it's so critical. And so I'm always really surprised when, these days I'm working with like the literary publishing establishment, or in the past when I was with museums, that there was a real sense that sports were somewhere between distasteful to like actually had caused people pain and they were never going to go there. Whereas I similarly see that there's such a connection.
Well, it's the athletes are stupid thing.
Right. And they don't read books.
And they don't read books. Athletes are stupid. They don't read books.
Right. They don't go to the opera.
They're assholes. They're the kids who picked on me in high school. Who then went nowhere in their life. Like, how many movies in the 90s were there about like the asshole jock who couldn't spit out a coherent sentence? and was the antagonist of the story.
Right. Yeah.
And I think we're still fighting that. But if you just look at what is happening neurochemically in your brain when you're working out, it is such a massive advantage to people whose careers depend on coming up with good ideas. Just simply from the dopamine and norepinephrine release that happens after a good workout.
Yeah.
And how common that is for me. I've really just like, I have a hard time decoupling writing from athletics at this point.
Interesting. Yeah.
So do you ever feel like there's a particular, if you're working on a particular problem, there's a kind of workout or form of movement that you'll do to solve that problem?
Yeah, I think for me, especially if I'm working through a writing problem, or if I'm planning, if I'm going to create a new keynote and I'm kind of like searching for what that language is, or framing an exhibition or something like that. For me, repetitive movement outdoors, so whether that's going for a trail run, going for a hike, sometimes going for a swim, but I don't know about you, but I have this weird thing where if I go for a long swim, which I love to do, I find that almost puts me in this brain loop of obsessively
Sharks.
I don't think about sharks at all. It's so funny when I heard you say that on another podcast, and I was like, man, I swim around the pier all the time. I never think about sharks. I think about the sea lions. I'm like, how far away are those sea lions? Where did they go under the water? Where are they going to come up? But no sharks. But no, I think for me, swimming, I kind of like, it's like I can get a snippet of a thought again and again and again, but I'm not able to kind of work through something. And so I think, being alone, movement in nature. I bike everywhere, and that's really helpful for me. And I try to be attentive to like not putting in headphones when I do some of these things, but instead just letting it be a loose time. But group activity, for me, that is almost impossible for me to work through something, but it is something that's such an adrenaline and dopamine and just joy injector and a switching. So it also, to what you were saying, I don't necessarily have the sense of, it's hard for me to start. But I really like a reward. So I love writing early in the morning and then hitting my word count or whatever I'm trying to do that day, closing the computer and being like, ooh, now I get to go play volleyball. Now I get to, and so I think that for me, those, just as sleep is recovery, I feel like joyful, interrelated activity outside and in the sun is very restorative for my creative juice as well.
Would you classify yourself as an introvert?
No, absolutely not.
Extrovert?
Yeah.
All the way you get ideas and energy by being around people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the hardest things for me about the career switch from running an organization, a community organization that put on events all the time, to now being a writer and writing alone.
You're a lonely novelist.
Right.
Yeah.
But the good thing is I don't work that much. So
Right.
I get my work done and then I
Sure.
go out in the world. But no, I feel like, especially now the work that I'm doing, it's like you have to be focused and very committed and somewhat introverted to be able to like dial into writing with no distractions. But then, I mean, so much of being a good novelist is about being curious about people and how do people think about things and how they relate. And so I feel like now it's part of my job to be social, because that's where, I just was with somebody the other day who was telling me about how every Sunday growing up, her parents were obsessive medievalists, and they would host these dinners with like 8 to 20 people speaking in Latin and stuff. I never would have come up with this, and it's like, if you don't meet people and, it's.
So these days, now that your top line title is novelist and you're studying people to come up with good character insights, do you find it easier to be around intolerable people? Because they're good characters?
I'm so into novelty, Kyle. And I will, especially when I'm traveling, I am just seeking out people where I can just like, let me suck your crazy story. And I'm so into it. Absolutely.
Your myopia and petulance and just little bouts of anger. Like, this is great fodder for the story.
I mean, I don't want to go on a multi-day trip with them, but a couple hours, I'm like, yes, I want to be next to the person who people are backing away from. Absolutely.
Do you now ask people questions to draw out more of that stuff? To like, how do you actually mine that material in a conversation? What would that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that, when I was working in museums, my whole focus was on designing exhibits and spaces that got strangers to talk to each other. And so for a long time, I've been fascinated by this problem of what are the questions where you're not only able to yield an interesting result from somebody, but where you'd be genuinely interested in asking 10 people the same question and you wouldn't get bored by their answer. And I think that if we're really honest, there are not a ton of questions where you're genuinely interested in what a random stranger has to say. And so I feel like I've been collecting those kinds of questions for 20 years. And I have some like standby go-tos that have been really fun. I love asking people about what their worst job was.
Okay.
But even like the beach volleyball group that I put together on Sundays, we, everybody groaned at first when I brought this up, and now people are obsessed with it. We always start with an icebreaker. Like I always have a question of the day while we're warming up. And there are now women who, if they're not even in the set that day, will show up at the beach at 7:30 in the morning because they're like, I gotta find out what the question is. And I think that a good question you can answer. You have an answer right away in your head, and you can answer on a shallow level, or you can take it deep if you want to. And it's totally up to you, where instead of the person who's being asked being put on the spot or being made to feel vulnerable or pushed out of their comfort zone, if you give them the room to decide how deep, there is incredible power to where people will take it. And then especially, I mean, the next level of that, especially in a group, is if you get a couple people who you start with, who are going to give different kinds of answers. And that's like, so much of the museum work I did was about designing exhibits with talkbacks, right? Where visitors could share stories. And a good talkback is not one where everybody's answering the same way. A good talkback is one where there are really different answers, and some of them are one word and some of them are a life story, because then as a new person walking up, you know that you're held within that whole space and you can find the place you want to enter.
Okay. This is the juicy stuff. I'm a big fan of good questions.
Right, of course, it's what you do.
It's the fastest way I've ever seen people's lives change. Is if you can ask the right question. Yeah. Because there's actually a part of my book where I talk about there's this study done on this. I believe is an orangutan named Kanzi. Have you heard about this?
Okay.
So it was this brilliant orangutan who could use a lexigram to write like kale raw, like that's what I want for food, like and roughly had the linguistic skills of a 2-year-old toddler. Okay. But the primary difference cognitively between a 2-year-old toddler and an orangutan or any other primates that we know of is that a 2-year-old toddler can make requests for information. Mm-hmm. So a primary difference between humans and other primates is our ability to wonder and ask questions.
Well, and I think it's so interesting too with conversation, like anytime you're meeting new people, you have the choice of how open you're going to be about yourself, but also what kind of question you're going to ask. And I've really found that people are, for the most part, surprised, delighted, and maybe a little confused if you ask them a question that's a little more personal than they expected, given that you're standing around chatting in a coffee shop or whatever it would be. And that so many people, that delight is the most common response I get in those situations. And then what you get back is so incredibly rich. Yeah.
So you said that you've honed a few of these questions that you kind of have in your back pocket for random encounters, whether it be with someone at the airport or someone you just bump into, or maybe a group setting. If you're curating an event and you start with a question, do any good ones come to mind?
Yeah, I think if anybody is talking about their business or an accomplishment or just what they're doing, I often like to ask a question like, what's the most surprising thing you've learned in doing X? Or what's something about that place that you traveled to that you just totally didn't expect? So looking for the deviance, because again, it's something where right away, somebody's telling you about a trip, they'll be like, oh my God, we walked into this what we thought was a quickie mart, but then there was a it's not hard for people to come up with an answer, which is really important, because if you stump people too much, they start to second guess themselves and they start to feel stupid. But you want to get them off the track of the version of the story they've always told. So it's sort of like if you imagine that the person is giving their 5-minute spiel about their business, about their trip, whatever, it's like, how can you ask them a question that is information that's available quickly to them, but is not within the spiel? And then they're delighted because they get to talk about something else. One of my favorite things too is if you're ever with a couple and you can get one of them to talk about a story that the other one hasn't heard, that's like it's a gift to them too, because they're just like,
you're watching them fall in love more.
Yeah, and also just like out of the grooves of I thought I knew everything about this person.
Right, which creates novelty and newness in a relationship.
Right.
Is if you've known someone for 20 years and then you uncover this other part of them that you've just never asked about, it's a total gift.
Yeah. And I'm amazed at also how quickly, I know I do this, how quickly I start to make judgments and assumptions that like, oh, I've spent 12 minutes with you. I get what you're about. And actually, there probably are a lot of things, what do I know about you? You're a surfer, you live in Santa Monica, you grew up here. I could make a lot of assumptions, and maybe a lot of those would lead to stories you would tell me that would confirm that. But then what I try and do is really get curious about resisting that, and me asking myself, okay, like this person who's in front of me, what are you worried about at night? Or it's often easy just to ask people like, what's something that's really firing you up these days? Just getting people talking about something with passion is going to be interesting. And then one of the weirdest great stories I heard recently, I write murder mysteries, and I was at this big conference for people who write crime fiction. And one of the things that I don't love about writers is that outside of the work time, at least in my world, I don't know if it's true in your world, all they want to do is stand around and drink and talk. And like, I can do that like one night a month, but like otherwise I want to be going for a hike, I want to be going for a run, whatever. So I'm always looking for how can I make that experience more interesting. Yeah. So I met this cop, this homicide detective, and he I was asking him about his background. He said, oh, he worked in sex crimes before that. And I said, oh, that must have been hard. And he was the one who gave me the gift. I played into the slipstream by saying that must have been hard. He said, he had a real thick accent too. He's like, yeah, but there was a lot of funny things that happened in sex crimes. And I was like, what's a funny story that happened in sex crimes? And he told me an insane story about these women who were trying to be vampires. And it's just like a story I will never forget. And it came from this deviance of him saying there's something funny that happened in sex crimes. Like, so I feel like asking people about, the non-assumed part of their job or their experience is often going to yield something really rich.
I don't know how you could get into that one. You'd be like, so you worked in sex crimes. What's your funniest sex crime story?
Right. That one you probably can't ask.
He had to lead that one.
Right. But I definitely, when I met him, my initial pitch to him was like, hey, do you want to come hang out with a bunch of, crime writers and regale them with some of your wildest stories? And he was like, hell yeah. So he came in ready to, not everybody comes in ready to perform the way that guy did. Yeah.
A friend of mine is a comedian, and he says, he's told me, your first joke should confirm the audience's assumption about you, and the second should obliterate it.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. And it's so interesting also when you enter into a new space and you decide what's my first joke in this situation, and am I going to then choose to obliterate it, or am I just going to build that? And I think that especially one of the great gifts of getting older, I think, professionally, is when I was young, I was so obsessed with like, oh my God, I have to keep being, whether it's perfect or whatever, but I have to keep being that thing to the nth degree if I want to build a brand, if I want to build a reputation, And I feel like the older I get, the more I get excited about, no, I want to just keep obliterating or playing with that thing.
Right.
Yeah.
How much improv have you done?
None.
how much do you think about going into a situation and playing a part?
A lot. I mean, as an extrovert, and now especially, it used to be I ran an organization, and when you run an organization, you and when you're a boss, one of the gifts, especially if you're trying to create a safe container for creativity, is you need to hold that space with some consistency. So, for example, if you're going to say to your employees, like, I want you to take risks, you have to not just say that, you have to then, as we did, like, you have to have the failure punch card where it's like, we're going to celebrate, like, what were the most boneheaded things we did, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And inconsistency is a killer for an employee or somebody who reports to you or somebody who's going to invest in you, back you, feeling like their time, their livelihood, their dollars are safe and secure with you. Versus now I get to be a creative. Now I get to be a lone wolf. And also now I'm often showing up for 2 days or for your book festival or for, to be a speaker at this conference. Or I'm often, if I'm, running a workshop at an event, I've been brought in to play the part of the creative rabble-rouser or the change agent person. And then it's like, okay, you can do whatever you want. Yeah, exactly. And so I think that I no longer feel that it's like a straitjacket of the role I have to play. Now I feel like I have opportunity to make choices and to play with it. And that's because my responsibilities to people are more fleeting, and more, there's an expectation that I'm going to be a creative shit stirrer. And so, okay, I'm going to go for that.
Right. I think that there's a lot of freedom to be had in dialing up or down different parts of your personality actively for fun in different situations. Sure. I think that that's a doorway to personal growth and just realizing that it is a choice, that the CEO is wearing a costume,
right,
that the creative is wearing a costume. I think that it allows you to adorn your personality and choose how you want to show up.
Yeah, and I think it is different too that, I remember once I was part of this group of like 100 art CEOs from around the world who got some business school support. And I always remember this person said, when you're the CEO of an organization, it's like you are a highway patrol person driving down the freeway in your vehicle. And you're just trying to get home or you're just trying to get to food or whatever. But everybody else is subtly changing their behavior around you because they see your vehicle. Yeah. And I think that that is a particular responsibility and onus of being a boss. And so I think that I spent so many years as a boss that now that I have no employees, the only people who I work with, most of them are imaginary. And if they say shit I don't like, I could just change it. Like, that is, I am loving that liberation.
Yeah. One of my favorite comedians, Neil Brennan, said being around famous people is like driving with a cop behind you, where you're like, oh, eyes on 10 and 2, officer, what do you know? He said you're performing normalcy around famous people, powerful people, people who have great influence over your life. And it does subtly change behavior in ways that aren't always fun.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that I think one of the things I like to try and play with is like, how can I try and be even more myself when I notice that I might be feeling that way about somebody? And I grew up, my dad was a rock musician. He was, famous in his own time and way. And so I also grew up with one of those people who was always performing. And I love my dad so dearly. I lost him a few months ago, but, a lot of, they also can never get out of the cop car. My dad loved to perform, whether it was for just me and my sister or whether it was for, 10,000 people in a stadium. And that was his natural state. And so I think also the choice of when you're going to perform and when you're just going to be your messy self and to know that it's a gift to get to do that, because some people, either because they're addicted to the performance or because of the expectations of others, they never get to get out of that car. They never get to get off that stage.
What was your dad's name?
Screamin' Scott Simon. He was in the band Sha Na Na. They played at Woodstock. They were the band in the movie Grease. He wrote the song Sandy in Grease, and he joined the band when he was 20 years old. and he died last year at 75, and had never had any job besides being in Sha Na Na. Yeah, his whole life. Yeah.
What do you think the greatest lesson your dad ever taught you was?
I think there are two. One is just to be wholeheartly and joyfully yourself. I mean, I remember being in about sixth grade, growing up in LA, and walking with him to the bus stop. And this was like the early 90s. Yoga was not cool yet. My dad would wear these bright pink yoga pants that were so tight, like they showed his whole package, and we would be like, oh my God, this is mortifying. And he'd be like, you girls think you're so counterculture shopping at thrift stores, but when I wear what I want to wear, you da-da-da. So there's that. And then also, one of the things about Sha Na Na, and one of the things they're known for, they were sort of a novelty act. They did all these doo-wop, and their whole thing was playing oldies real fast. And so growing up in LA in the 80s and 90s, a lot of the artists who were into Sha Na Na were, like, I remember Exene and X, punk. The Beastie Boys were big fans. Heavy metal folks were big fans because Sha Na Na put on a show. They changed costumes. They had dance performances. They had audience participation. And I learned from him, even though it looked silly. My dad hated classic rock. He hated grunge. He felt like it was offensive for an artist to turn their back to the audience or not give a shit about what they wore on stage. He felt like that was an absolute disgrace in terms of their relationship with their audience. And so I feel like one thing I learned, I never did improv, but I lived with a man who, I remember walking down the street with him one day, and there was a stoplight, and all these cars stopped. I mean, I must have been about 7 at the time, and he goes, Nina, play along. And he starts giving me this crazy Heimlich and throws me on the hood of a car that's waiting to go, and we're just enacting this impromptu scene that my dad thought would be funny, and so I think that there are downsides certainly to growing up with a performer, being somebody who's always on in that way, but I just learned how much rigor and respect there is in a relationship with an audience, and that if you want that relationship to be deep and meaningful, you have to put in a lot of work, and you can't just assume they're going to show up or take them for granted. And I feel like my dad cared so deeply about putting on a great show and really what that relationship with the audience was like. And I learned a lot from that I play into in my artistic work and also into, marketing, sales, fundraising. I take seriously the fact that when somebody's giving me their attention, that is an incredible gift, and I should not take it lightly. And whether, it's a dinner party or whether it's a 2,000 person conference that I'm speaking at, I want to earn the interest and the attention of the people I'm with, because I don't take it for granted, and I learned that from my dad.
We're going to dig in a little more here. How does that look for you in terms of, well, I'll tell you where I'm getting at. I think that it's the distance between no one's paying attention to me or my work, boohoo, and I'm so overwhelmed. Everyone wants my time and attention, and now I'm giving myself permission to be a little disrespectful to people, is the difference between a couple hundred people. You don't have to get that famous to feel overwhelmed by the amount of people who want your time. So what does that look like for you to navigate that? Because maybe people who listen to the show aren't famous, but they feel busy. They feel like, okay, maybe my business is growing. Their people want my time, and maybe I do have some fans, and I'm giving myself permission now to act out in the ways that before I had any power, I would keep to myself.
Yeah. Well, I will say that personally, I would say I'm pretty bad at boundaries, but I'm good at priorities. And so and I've had different waves of this in my own life. I mean, and first of all, very instructive to have a parent who was way more capital F famous than I will ever be. And yet, when I was in my 20s, I started a blog that became the biggest blog in the museum industry. I went from being this little exhibit designer to suddenly being called by museums all over the world and asked to, come consult or come talk or whatever. I wrote a novel secretly and embarrassingly sitting by my mom while she was sick, and then it became a New York Times bestseller, and Reese Witherspoon, put her magic fairy dust on it. And so I've experienced those things a couple times. And what I would say is yes, you can make different choices. I always remember somebody saying to me, why do people care so much about inbox zero? Like, why are we proud to have gotten back to people faster so they can ask us for more stuff? And like, is that the cycle? Is that the cycle you want to prioritize? And so, that's something early on I really learned about, like, okay, I'm going to have like my 7-day folder where it's like, I still have a high priority on getting back to everybody. I can't become one of those people who's like, oh, I got 12,000 unread email. Like, I just can't do that. But I can say, you go into my Friday slot. You don't need this right now. And then I think also, frankly, for most of us, the time when we are in demand in that way is quite fleeting. And so looking at it as a gift, and saying, gosh, how lucky am I to have this problem right now? And then deciding what to do with that. Who are you going to prioritize? What's going to be important to you? And, one of the examples I think about is that I'm dealt with right now is, I wrote this murder mystery called Mother-Daughter Murder Night that has done very well. And I wrote it as a love letter to my mom while she was going through the hardest first year of a terminal cancer prognosis. And thank God my mom's doing great right now. But I wrote this book, at her bedside while this was all happening. And the main character of the book, like my mom, was sort of this superhero version of my mom, where my mom was stuck in bed. And I wrote this character who was this, tough Jewish businesswoman from LA. My mom is all those things, who also had stage 4 cancer. But instead of being stuck in bed, this person was leaping out of bed to solve a murder mystery. And I went on tour. I spent a lot of time on tour for this book. And a lot of people, the story I felt honored to get to tell was not about the book, but it was about my mom. And it was about this connection and how a creative project gave us an escape hatch during an incredibly terrible time. And when people come up to me and I'm on book tour and they want their book signed, 1 out of 2 are telling me a story about their caregiving journey, their own cancer journey, the person they lost, the person, I'll never forget the person who said to me, gosh, I wish I had found a way to connect with my person during that time the way you did. We never figured it out. And I just regret, and so people are so personal, and I want to give them all of my energy in that moment. Now, when people reach out to me on social media or on email to say that they love the book, I read it, I receive it with gratitude, and I have keystrokes I use to have generic responses to them that are nice, and if they want to tell me about, I get emails every once in a while where it's like, I'm in the hospital right now while my mom is having surgery and your book helped me have an escape during this time. I'm not using the keystroke email for that person, but I am for the person who's like, hey, that was a great book. Are you going to write another one? And so it's like, I think that my guess is, even if you feel that you are bombarded, we're all pretty far, hopefully, from the time when you are so overloaded that you literally can't deal. And so you can choose who to prioritize, and you're probably not getting too many of those precious connecting options. Now, I will say, in the very first month that this book came out and Reese's Book Club picked it, I had a nightmare month. I spent 5 or 6 hours a day on Instagram, which I'd never spent so much time on my phone before. I hated it. I was exhausted. I was falling back into old behaviors from CEO life of feeling like I had to perform on this wheel. But fortunately, Reese's Book Club picks a new book every month. And so I was like, oh my God, when is October coming? And I felt so grateful for it. But I got just a little taste of what it would be like to be over that edge. And I know that if I ever went over that edge again, I would hire help. No question.
Yeah. can you? So I'll tell you how I first heard of you. I first heard, Nina Simon. She took over the Museum of Art and History, and she's making it really cool. Mm-hmm. That was, if you were in some light way in the distance, that was my only association with you. It was like, oh yeah, she's like young and cool, and she's making this thing that's typically not young and cool. That.
And you were probably like a 22, 23-year-old surfer at the time, so that's an even bigger.
You reached me.
That's amazing. Yeah,
totally.
Yeah.
And I work on creative campaigns for companies, and one of my favorite lines that I ever heard from a creative director was, "Brand is a slight overcorrection to a cultural injustice."
Mm-hmm.
So close your eyes and think of a museum: boring, cold, solitary, old people. Maybe not you. Maybe you don't think that because you've done so much. But for me, who's not a museum guy, that's what it's like. Oh, their house is like a museum.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's cold. I don't feel comfortable there.
Yeah.
Probably very cold, distant parents around. And what you've been able to do with Museum of Art and History, I felt was exactly what needed to happen because it was an overcorrection to that cultural injustice.
Yes.
Were you conscious of doing that at the time?
Oh, yeah, 1,000%. So, okay, a couple of things I'd say about that. First, one of the things, so when I took over the museum as the director, it was about to close. It was almost bankrupt. And I called a couple of people, mentors of mine, who had run turnarounds before. And I said, what do you need to be able to do a great turnaround? And I'll never forget this one museum director, David Cheeseborough. He was at COSI in Columbus. He said, you need to find out if the reputation of this organization in your town is that it's a nothing, like nobody knows about it, or if it has done real harm that needs to be overcome. And he said, if you start with a nothing and you're going to put it on the map, that's a much faster and easier turnaround than if you have to do repair before you can even get to zero. And I was like, oh, I've been living in this town for a few years. I'm a creative person and I've never heard about this. And it's in an amazing location. I've never heard of this museum. It is in the first category. It is in the nothing category. So we can move quickly.
Right.
And then absolutely, you're right that just, and we used to talk about, should we change the name of the museum? And there's this whole question in branding, right? About like, is there more power? And I always remember I worked for the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. for a while, which is a very cool, fun museum. And we talked at times about changing the name. And we had a director, a COO there who came from Disney. And he always said, if I'm the best spy experience or espionage event in D.C., I gain nothing. But if I'm the coolest museum in DC, I gain a lot. And I think that there is power to the kind of reclaiming and transforming of a concept as opposed to being like, this is a community experience place or something. But absolutely, in architecture, we talk about this idea of threshold fear, that there are some spaces, banks are a good example, where there are all these architectural cues to make you understand that a certain kind of person belongs here and it's not you. And I always used to, in working with other museums, we would talk about, okay, let's go downtown. And I want you to walk into businesses that make you uncomfortable. For some people, that might be a boxing gym. For me, nail salons fall into that category, or like a candle store. I just can't do it. And really inviting people to notice, what are all the cues that are making you feel that this is not for you? And then you go back to the place you run, which you think, of course, is easy to walk into, especially if it's a cultural amenity, if it's free, any of those kinds of things. And then you start identifying
the people look and dress like you in
exactly.
there. Yeah.
Well, and to the point of overcorrection, with the with the Museum of Art and History, I knew that right away, because Santa Cruz is a creative place, we could tap into that. We could partner with people. I said, nobody's going to trust that this museum is for them, but they trust that their friend's band is for them, or that this knitting collective is for them. So if we partner with people who, that we're riding on their brand to bring them in, and not just once, you need to come in like 5, 6, 10 times because you trusted something else before you even start to trust us. And then I'll say, though, one more thing, which is we were able in the first 2 years. The other thing about when an organization is about to close is, boy, you can post big, big growth easily because it was so shitty before, right? So we tripled attendance in the first year and a half.
Yeah,
but we
from
noticed,
0 to 3.
Yeah.
yeah.
But then we noticed who's who's coming younger. We started doing a lot of demographic research, and we saw, okay, we've aged down. We're now reflecting the age diversity of our county. We're reflecting the income diversity of our county, but we were not reflecting the ethnic diversity of our county, which is, pretty bicultural, white and Latino. And one of the things we started doing that enabled us to, match, we saw success as looking like our demos of who is coming reflects the age, income, and ethnic diversity of the county. And the thing you have to do is overcorrect, because if you, and I always remember this study I saw about middle school science classes, and if the posters in the room are scientists, famous scientists of both genders, boys will speak up more. If it's all women scientists, boys will speak up the equal amount, but girls will come up.
Yeah.
And so it's like, you need to overcorrect. If you think that this place is for old people, all the marketing has to show young people. Even if then older people are like, wait, why am I not on this flyer? It's like, you don't need a flyer to come in. You know the museum's for you. And similarly, if you're Latinx, if you imagine that this is a white space, we needed to, I was real proud that not only did we become a bicultural organization in terms of our staff and in terms of all the signage inside, but we had the first sign outside in downtown Santa Cruz that was in Spanish. And it deliberately faced the river levee because we talked to Latino families who live down in the beach flats, and they said, we don't go downtown. Pacific Avenue is white, but we go on the river levee. And we're like, okay, we are putting Tu Museo big on that side. And then, as you're saying, you have to deliver on that promise. Because the other thing that happens, all kinds of brands do this, but maybe nonprofits are the worst at this, I think, is they lie. They put a sign that says, this is your museum, this is a community place. And then you come in and it's really fucking boring, or it's cold or whatever. And part of the challenge is the other people who are in there. I used to do work with symphonies. It's impossible, because even if the organization wants to age down, wants to welcome people to wear what they want, it's the other patrons sitting next to you who are shushing you and who are making you feel insecure for being there. So you have to not just change what you're doing organizationally. If you're running a venue, people, when you were working for Mudwater, like, people might have an idea of who else buys it, but they're not showing up. They're not only drinking it with 200 other people around and realizing, fuck, everybody else here has a dog. I don't have a dog. But if you run a venue, people, you're keying not just on who the staff are or what's on stage. You're keying on who else is here, and are these people like me, or at least is there space for me within the diversity of the people who are here. And so you have to way overcorrect if you want people who have never felt welcome in that space, who felt that threshold fear, who thought it was boring, to even imagine that they might have a good time there.
So much to get into right now. Many people will be listening to this who haven't been to Santa Cruz, who don't know what this looks like. Can you paint a quick picture of what the Museum of Art and History looks like now?
Yeah. Okay, well,
And
the real thing to know, is downtown Santa Cruz is one of the few really great, and it's almost a stage set of a downtown at this point because of how things have changed with retail and stuff like that. But there is a beautiful, fun, 8-block walking district with restaurants and stores and wide sidewalks and street performers, and the energy of the town is on display. And it is not Universal City Walk. It is not owned by somebody. It feels public. Now, that's a simplified view because there's a lot of issues underneath that, but the life of downtown Santa Cruz feels cool, feels creative. The museum is half a block off of the main drag. And yet when I came to run the museum, it was like there was a reverse magnet. Like, people did not know it was there, or more people knew it used to be the county jail, and it hadn't been a jail in like 20 years. And you just brought up Abbott Square. There was a patch of bricks, a shaded brick patio separating the museum from that cultural life of downtown. And it turns out that shitty brick patio was controlled by the museum, but we never did anything out there. And when I came to the museum, I knew, A, we were nothing, we were not a negative in the community, and B, it was a great fucking building in a great fucking location. And there was this patio linking it that was like a dead zone. It was like a weird, it wasn't creepy, but it wasn't great. And but right away I was like, we're going to transform what happens inside. And our whole strategy was, we're going to start with events, because we can't make this whole building great, especially we didn't have any money, but we can make it great for one night. You come for the surf art night, you come for the fashion art night, whatever, we can make it great for that night. Then we start building money to make the inside of the museum and the exhibitions reflective of the community. Then the next step, and it just keeps taking more money to do this, is to transform that plaza. And so that was my baby, was that project, and I spent years slowly transitioning tenants out of the ground floor of that office building next to the museum so that we could do a food hall there, and then doing a redesign of the plaza to expand it and to put some great public art in to make it a place for downtown performances. Because the other thing that complicates that pretty story about downtown Santa Cruz, and you grew up here, is that during the time I was at the MA, the city was actually kind of going to war on artists downtown because they were trying to figure out how to deal with issues around drug use and homelessness, and their solution was so often about removing public space. If a business owner was upset because some guy was sitting whacked out of his brain and yelling on a bench right outside the building, they called the city enough, the city would just take out the bench. They didn't replace the bench. They didn't deal with the mental health. They took out the bench. And we literally got some grants for Abbott Square. One of my data points was, the city has taken out 2/3 of the benches on Pacific Avenue. And the other thing they went after was street performers. Because the difference between a person yelling on the sidewalk and a person playing music, we all know what it is, but it's real hard to put that in
like
the city ordinance.
3 octaves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's and it's whether your drum, what's your drum made of? Right?
Yeah. How's your rhythm? Are you just like throwing something, or is it throwing in rhythm?
Right.
Good rhythm.
So we knew that this plaza, because it felt public, but it wasn't city property, we could make it a place for performances. And it's bananas that a city as creative as Santa Cruz did not have a place you could go downtown reliably on the weekend and see live music and dance and hang out with your friends. And Abbott Square is that place. And I think one of the things, though, I'll say about building Abbott Square, which was like a 5-year, $3 million project, is I had to be real humble about the fact that no matter how good a museum is, there are going to be a lot of people who are never going to walk into a building called museum. And even when we asked people in the community, what do you want from a community plaza downtown? Of course, they said, we want creativity. We want families to feel welcome here, which was a big issue. So many people told me, nobody will ever feel safe going downtown Santa Cruz. You can't put chairs out in downtown Santa Cruz. And we just say, no, we're going to flood it with positive use. But the other thing people said all the time was there's got to be food. And there was a real exercise in humility to realize that actually, even though we were so excited to program it with all this art and history and community stuff, a great coffee shop, Anchor, Cat and Cloud, and a great bar, Front and Cooper, were going to do more than we ever could programmatically to make people feel that this was a place they wanted to be socially and engaged. So I think sometimes we're not honest with ourselves about the limits of what our brand or our product can do, and we're not willing to that was a Freudian slip of using humiliate, but it is the difference between humility and humiliation, is pretty close. And to be able to say, we're a museum and we're going to raise money to have a for-profit restaurant come in because they can do a better job than us at getting the people, that takes being willing to say, we can't achieve this with the products we have. Yeah.
People love art, but they love potentially getting laid even more.
Oh, when I took over the Ma, Kyle, I had moved to Santa Cruz.
And being able to say, we met at a museum.
Yeah, I love that. Right? Yeah. Well, when I came to Santa Cruz, which was 4 years before I took the job at the Ma, my plan, I'd been an exhibit designer who built exhibits that got strangers engaging with each other. My plan was to open a bar. And I'm so glad I didn't. I'm not a late night person, but like I built exhibits to get strangers talking to each other. Where do you want to meet strangers? Sure, you want to tell people you met them at a museum, but at a bar. And like, I feel like bars have all of these like C- level activities like darts or trivia. Like trivia, it's fun, but there's so many things that could be so much cooler. And so anyway, I had this whole business plan to open this bar that was a vehicle for like weird exhibits that got people engaging with each other. And it was only the fact that the museum was going under, and they called me and they're like, we want to be this community place. We don't know how to do it. You're a consultant who does this. Could you help us? And I turned to my husband and I was like, should I raise money and try and build this dream thing I have? Or should I take this institution that's a big fucking mess and has no money but has great bones and a great building and says that they want to be a community space, and should I try and turn around that? And I just feel so lucky, not just that I chose that option, but that they chose me too. And they were willing to take a chance on, as my husband would always say, pretty hard to hire somebody with a 2 in the front of their age, to run an organization like that.
Yeah, you were 29 when you took it over.
Yeah.
It's so fucking important to be humble about your project and the reasons that people will actually want to engage with your project. And it's so hard to do because if you're spending 14 hours a day on this thing, you slowly start to believe that it's the most important thing in everyone's world. Therefore, the surf exhibit museum will just go bananas because that's going to be at the top of everyone's priority list because it's been at the top of your priority list all along. And this problem exists in brands of all shapes and sizes, right? It's a toothbrush company trying to change the world, It's a shoe company that's going to be the biggest part of your day. Some of the smartest creatives I know say you win by owning a moment. You make a great small moment in that person's day. In your case, we went to the mall. We had a great drink. It was a really fun thing. I met this fun person. You just owned that sliver, even if it was just a 20-minute sliver in that person's day.
Yeah.
And you are winning.
Yeah.
But you need to be really honest about what is going to get. You need to be honest about the fact that a lot of people are not going to want to come into a museum, but they will go into a bar, and having an opener that's like, hey, if you've been to the museum, actually makes the bar a better situation, because the problem with bars is no one knows how to open a conversation with each other, even though it's a bunch of people that just want to meet other people. So the coupling of the entertainment and I would even say the coupling of a bit of narcissism that we all have with the altruism of what's good for a community is how you can build something that is really potent.
Well, and different kinds of social infrastructure, right? An exhibit's a different kind of social infrastructure than a bar. Yeah, and I think the very beautiful paradox in what you just said is you still have to love that toothbrush so fucking much, And I think I'm a big believer. One of the things I've learned from working with artists for a long time is that the most interesting things to me often exist, and the most interesting brands or events, they exist at this place of creative friction where you can literally feel the vibration of why are there ukuleles and opera singers in the same place, or why is there and so I think that you need to be able to hold, I love this toothpaste thing, or I'm figuring out every single thing about how we're going to do the bricks, concrete differently in Abbott Square so that XYZ. And then you have to let go of the fact that nobody's ever going to notice how much time we spent thinking about how the sandblasting in the concrete worked to be able to give a sense of lightness in a certain way. And so it's you have to, and that's what gets so hard, right? Because the more you fall in love with it, the more you believe it's relevant to other people, and it just isn't.
Yeah, and it goes back to what my comedian friend said, right? It's confirm their suspicions and then obliterate them, right? That it's a museum. Oh, but it's really fun also. So if you get people to do that little double take, then they lean in.
And that's something, the person a person I've learned a lot from about writing fiction is this guy Donald Moss, and one of the things he always says is you have to keep waking readers up. That there's this tension in a book that on the one hand you want to fall into the fictive dream, you want to believe that the story, you're fully there, those characters are real, but if they do exactly what you think they will do, and if they say exactly what you think, then you fall asleep. And it's you need to be in a dream that feels so consistent but is so full of surprises.
And you do that by constantly making the characters do surprising things.
Yeah, surprise on every page. That's what he would always. Yeah, and my phone. I have a friend who I really respect who every year for the new year, I promise is going somewhere, she's like, I don't make New Year's resolutions, but I set a mantra, and at least she used to then change her computer lock screen password to be that word or whatever it is, so she's writing it a lot. I changed my phone background similarly, and right now, and these are things pasted up in my wall, but my one for 2025 is make weird choices. And I think that when people make weird choices, we get really curious, and it can't be so chaotic. In the case of a story, if a book jumps too many points of view, or if a brand, is changing their message every week, we kind of are they're a hot mess. I don't know what's going on over there. But if there's weirdness within a world, it just brings you more and more.
You want to keep watching.
Yeah.
And the same goes even for ads. If there's a certain brand, One of my favorites these days is Liquid Death. Do you know them? They're a canned water company that is the most punk rock canned water company
It's so
out
funny
there.
because I've seen the cans
Yeah.
and I actually have no clue what the it's water.
It's just water,
Are you
and
serious?
the whole thing's a joke. But
Okay.
they're a huge brand now because they put their marketing dollars behind doing these crazy stunts and ads, and it just keeps you.
But here's
leaning
such an
in.
interesting thing for me who's like one step out of
Yeah.
that. I recall first seeing those at the same time as I saw Monster and some of these other energy drink things, and caffeinated drinks, which I've just never engaged with that category. And so I just sort of assumed Liquid Death was in there. It's just like when I was a teenager, I worked with this guy who would always wear Metallica t-shirts or Grateful Dead t-shirts at this flower store where I worked. And I assumed that the Grateful Dead was a heavy metal band, having never heard them because the iconography is so similar.
Yeah.
And so it's funny how like, oh my God, Liquid Death is water. I would never have guessed
Yeah.
that.
Well, so the way that it got started, I actually have a personal anecdote to this. I was friends with this group of pro mountain bikers in Santa Cruz growing up, and one of them was sponsored by Rockstar Energy. So he had this mini fridge in his house, and we'd go over to his house and take Jaeger bombs, and then you drink the Rockstar Energy drink after. And one night, I'm at his house. I take a shot of Jaeger. I chase it with Rockstar, and it's just water. And I'm like, ew, what is this? And he goes, oh yeah, they give this to us after competitions because the last thing you want after doing a huge bike race is to drink an energy drink. So they give us cans of water. So a lot of what you see the athletes, Red Bull, Rockstar, Monster drinking on the podiums are just filtered water in a branded can. And the founder of Liquid Death was like, that's crazy that you could just have water in these cans.
Yeah.
What if we did a whole joke brand based on that?
Wow. Oh, I love it.
But yeah, I love brands that surprise us.
Yeah.
And so
Wait, can I
Yeah,
go
go.
to the bathroom?
yeah, go ahead.
We were talking earlier about the conversation, like how to get into real conversations with people. And when we live in a world where we mostly choose to hang out with people in spaces that are expected in some way, it again like reinforces this idea that we're going to have the expected conversations. But if I was like, hey Kyle, let's go to an exhibit, and we go to this exhibit and I really love something, but you're like, what the hell is this? Or you're really confronted by something and I'm like curious about it. It gets us into a different conversation. And I mean, I spent a lot of time, I did not grow up going to museums and loving museums. I came into museums, I had been an engineer and I was interested in the design problem of like, these places say that they are for everyone, but they make a lot of people, including me, feel stupid. And I especially felt that way about art museums. And it actually took a boyfriend I had in college who was an artist who I remember we went to an art museum once and there was this exhibit that he started laughing at. And I was like, don't laugh. Like, I was like, we're going to get into it. Don't laugh. And he's like, it's funny. The artist is making a joke. And I had never let my guard down enough. I was so in my head about how I didn't get it that I wasn't able to really connect with the art. And I feel like one of the things I've learned is that, and also, artists are such rad people often who are deeply interested in people connecting with what they're doing. And so it's so weird. I have an artist friend who I've done a lot of work with who used to talk about how museums are where art goes to die, that the way that things are often exhibited robs it of a lot of its energetic power or its political juice sometimes or things like that. And so I think that many museums do not live up to their potential to be catalytic spaces for gathering and activism and connection, but I do think that that is their greatest potential, and that more and more museums are moving in that direction to say, hey, we need they're rarely free, unfortunately, in this country, but we need non-commercial spaces for the dangerous ideas that artists are bringing forward or the wild ideas. Running a museum of art and history, people used to say, how do these things go together? And I'd say, well, history tells us where we came from and artists help us imagine where we're going. And like, how often do we have a conversation about, you want to talk about climate change. It's like, oh, climate change is shitty. Yeah, it's really scary. Oh, the fires in LA. But you could go to an exhibit by artists like, like the Harrisons, where they did this project for years where they moved plants up the hillsides in the Sierras to show that this is a crazy project. Like, it doesn't make any sense, but they were moving plants to kind of talk about this idea that, hey, as temperatures change, ecosystems are going to change. Plants that lived here can't live there. And it's like, if you look at a ridiculous thing that an artist did or a crazy image, it could create a conversation that is deeper, that is more interesting, that is potentially transformative around issues that we really care about. Now, again, that's all an advertisement for art, not necessarily for museums. But I think that at their best, museums are staffed by people who are interested in being the interpreter and the conduit to invite people into that art experience. And, I started out working in science museums. And if you go to a place like the Exploratorium or the Boston Museum of Science, which is where I started, the whole job there is to say, how do we take this crazy physics or this wild thing about chemistry and make it tangible and understandable and relatable by regular people? Art museums work the opposite way. In art museums, the people who work there are like, we got to get out of the way of the artists because it would be rude of us to create an interpretive layer. And I don't believe that. I believe that if we want to invite people to spend more than 2 seconds looking at a piece of art, we need to give them ways in. And if they're coming in thinking I'm too dumb or I don't get it, we need to invite them. We need to do design work to get them into a space where they can laugh and they can go deep and they can enjoy. And there are so many different ways to do that. And my favorite museums are places that bring together objects and art and cultural stuff that we don't encounter in that way in regular life, and then put an interpretive layer and an experiential layer on it to invite you deeply into that thing.
And be able to participate?
Sure. Yes. And participation can be anywhere.
Give me examples of that. Yeah. What are examples of things that you would recommend? Like, for example, I have a friend he's very into art and he wants to have his house be an impromptu place for people to gather and have artists be able to show their work.
Sure.
What would you recommend for my friend? Hi, Charlie.
Yeah.
To make his home be the best possible expression of that, so that people like myself could go in and not feel dumb. I could go get something out of it, rather than just get my car and be like, that wasn't for me.
Okay, well, the amazing thing for Charlie or anybody looking to do this themselves is they can be so idiosyncratic about it. And the first thing I would say is do as an event. It's so much easier to invite people into something experiential in terms of being able to do the experience design, as opposed to saying anytime anybody walks into this exhibit, they're going to get the kind of experience that I'm seeking. So it's, dope it to make it easier for you in that way. And then I'd say figure out, what is especially if it's art that you love or objects that you're fascinated by, what is the experience you want people to have around it? So, for example, one of my favorite museums is not very participatory at all, but it invites a very weird participation, and that's the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Culver City in LA. And I grew up as like a nerdy and artsy and jockey kid in LA, and like, oh my God, I found this place where there's all this really, really weird stuff and you don't know if it's real or not. And, there's an exhibit of miniatures where there's all these sculptures that are like in the eye of a needle kind of thing. And they're incredible. And then there's a walnut shell and there's a long text that explains everything carved into this walnut shell. And you're looking at it, and then you're like, I think this is just a walnut shell. And so they took this approach where the participation there is about you with your own brain asking yourself, what am I seeing? What can I trust? What's happening here? What is, the story of this space? That's very cerebral. That's very in your head. Totally opposite examples, there are people who have created kind of reverential almost like a yoga or meditation practice of how to look at a work of art, and to say, okay, I'm going to spend 2 minutes starting at the upper left corner and down to the bottom, and then I'm going to spend 2 minutes and like you can make cards or you can give people instruction sets for how to engage with work. You can also say we're playing a game here, or I have a dear friend who for a long time ran this renegade museum tour company called Museum Hack. One of their favorite things they would do at the Met in New York is they'd ask people in a gallery, okay, if you were going to steal one thing from this room, what would it be? And so inviting people into a different way of engaging, whether that's about asking questions that invite people to really have a conversation. I like to say, a great exhibit is a social object. And you know how when somebody's walking their dog, like other people will talk to you, but they're sort of talking through the dog to you. Like the dog is this object that mediates the conversation.
Yeah,
right.
I don't have a dog, but I have a housemate who has a dog.
Okay.
And often he will, we recently moved, but often I would take his dog on walks when he would be out of town. And it was remarkable how differently they would treat me.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So a great exhibit is one that becomes that. And actually one of the best forms of museums that way is the zoo. And when you go to the zoo, a mentor of mine, Elaine Gurin, used to always talk about how in Jerusalem, one of the only places that people from different religions could go was the zoo, because the zoo, the exhibits are big enough that you can stand next to somebody who's from a different background from you and you're not scrunched up. But like if the giraffe does something funny, everybody's reacting. Oh, did you see that? And so there's sort of this safety. Even when I worked at the MA, one of the rules we had early on with the participatory art projects we were doing was we were never going to put out supplies such that everybody could have their own station. We wanted you to have the social interaction to say, hey, can you pass me those scissors? Or hey, can I have the green? And that is so safe, but it's radical to be sharing resources with people. So you can also be strategic about what do you want the social experience around this to be. And granted, a lot of people hated what I did at the MA because they felt that it was offensive or social engineering or making it into a circus to have different hooks to invite people into interacting around the work. People talked about instrumentalizing the art towards another social purpose. And it's like, yeah, that's what, people like you were talking, before we got started about the yes men, there are so many artists who are doing their work to be instrumentalized for another purpose. And so if you want activism to happen, you can't assume that just the work on the wall is going to do the thing. You have to then put the station right there to say, hey, are you pissed off about, let's say it's plastics, right? And you see these sculptures made of all plastics collected at the beach. Like people can look at it, they can be like, wow, it's beautiful. Wow, that's shitty. But if you would then add a layer of like, hey, here's a station where you can write a postcard to your congressperson about this right now, people will do it. And, when those things started out in museums, so many museum people were so nervous that visitors would not... would think that the museum was pushing their agenda on them. But like the Monterey Bay Aquarium was a real leader in this. They're like, we do have an agenda. We're a conservation organization. And so
we like the whales around and we're not afraid to say it.
And we're not just here to entertain you with whales. We're here for you to give a shit about whales. And then what they learned was even if people walked away giving a shit about whales, if you didn't give them an action they could, you know this from any campaign work. And so I think that thinking about what is the campaign of the way I want people to connect with this. And then the other thing I would highly recommend to anybody who wants to host and wants to create intentionality around space is to read The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker, because it is a brilliant book. And she's somebody who has been a facilitator both at like the UN, but also hosting great dinner parties. And I think that really thinking about what is the responsibility and the design opportunity as a host, whether it's of an event or of a space, to own that host responsibility, to be making space and reducing that threshold fear, creating that sense of welcome, and inviting people to bring their best self or whatever self, their silliest self, whatever you want in that space through a lot of design cues. I just can't recommend that book enough.
Okay, The Art of Gathering. That's a great title of a book. This is great. This is so fun. Last question on museums, and then I want to land the plane here with writing. Given your childhood, your literacy with people who get attention and people who are loved, people who are hated, did it make it easier to be hated as you were trying to build this thing? Because it is a prerequisite to anything that people love.
Yeah.
There's also going to be someone who hates it.
Oh, yeah.
So did you, when you were getting all this fire at you, feel like, oh, awesome?
It was a mix. And yes, and I got fire in so many ways. I mean, there were political cartoons about me in the paper. I had a nemesis who just sadly passed away, but he was like this 80-year-old man who would sit right outside the Octagon, which is in Abbott Square, right outside the museum every single day, all day. And he just hated me. And he wrote this blog and he would write these terrible things about me. And I had old ladies who would call me and be like, you don't care about art. I mean, and here's the thing. It took me a while. I think so many people, especially I come from an activist bent, and there is this message of like, if nobody's upset, you're not, you're not doing enough. And people like to say that, but then actually it's really freaking hard when people are directing that at you, especially if you're doing community work. And by the way, unlike, building a for-profit business where you're, throwing bombs, but maybe coming out with shitloads of money, nonprofit people do not come out of this with shitloads of money. And so, first of all,
you're not scaling it in the same way.
No, certainly not. There's no dividend. So it helped that I had a lot of friends who were activists. I remember I was good friends with the head of the Homeless Services Center at the time, who's now a county supervisor, Monica Martinez. And she would say, you're doing puppies with cancer over there. Like, it's so easy for people to love the museum. And I was like, oh, you're right. Your job is way harder. People are way more mad at you. And your job is actually way harder. And so being with other activists, being with political people who talk about like counting the votes, like getting strategic about you do not need everybody to like you. You need certain people or certain demos to like you. So learning to think politically in that way, but then also having a very private life of like going home and being really upset around my husband and being like, oh my God, this political cartoon, or oh my God, this person's suing us, or whatever it was. And then walking into work the next day and being fired up. And so two key moments I remember. One moment is I remember one day there was all this letters to the editor disagreeing about some exhibit we'd done, and I came into work and we had a staff meeting and I was like, this is so great, guys. It's like we're the warriors. People are actually giving a shit about what's happening inside a museum. And then I always remember a staff member said, yeah, but we don't get paid like the warriors. And I was like, fair. There is a version of insulation from foment, from hate, that money is an insulator. And we did not have that to bank on. However, fast forward a couple years, and there was a time I was out of town, and we'd opened this exhibit, and there were all these letters to the editor really upset about how it was like, representing victims, and because we'd gone to a fully bilingual museum and we'd redone the history gallery to tell more diverse stories than just the white city founders' stories. And there was a lot of negativity in the paper. And I remember being away and feeling this sense of like, it's kind of like a parent when your kid gets hurt and you're not there. I was like, oh my God, I want to be there to protect them, because I felt like one of my jobs, and this is a failing I maybe had it as a leader, was that I just felt like I had to fully own the change, and then my job was to take the blows and insulate my team so they could keep doing wild things. And I now feel mixed about that. But anyway, I just remember I was away, but on the Slack or whatever it was we used at the time, there was a staff member who was like, posted this stuff, and he's like, hell yeah, this means we're doing it right. And other people piling on and realizing, oh, right, now we all feel this way and we're fired up about it. So I think that, yes, it got easier and it got exciting. And also one thing I would always say, I was talking to a friend who's struggling with something like this right now, is I'd always say when people are complaining, and especially if they're attacking me personally or something like that, that means we're winning. Because this is their only recourse, is to write a letter to the editor of the newspaper that nobody gets. Like, we're winning. And so I think that also there was this, and this is sort of the athlete kind of competitive side, there's the activist side, but also the competitive side of like, oh, all you can do is yell shit from the stands. We're winning.
And you had a nemesis. I want a nemesis.
I loved having
maybe
a nemesis.
Maybe I don't like really want a nemesis, but I want to be able to say I have a nemesis.
Well, it's a good exercise to get a nemesis and to realize, oh, I have to see this person every day and I have to smile at them even if you don't have to smile at them, I guess. Like, I have some friends who are way saltier than me, but I think there's also this thing about we're human, and right. I can't tell you how many times also I would get a call from the front desk of the museum, and it'd be like, somebody has come in real fired up and real upset about something. I'd say, well, I got 10 minutes, send them upstairs. And then by the time they were in front of me, it's just like how, I mean, on the internet, obviously, like you can
I didn't
slang things.
really mean it, bro.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. And then it's like,
talk
okay,
to
then,
me.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I used to always say, like, you might not like it, but like I'm not going to bend over backwards for you. I'm going to be clear about what we're doing. I'm going to make sure our brand promise is we're not lying to anybody about this. We're going to be super transparent about it, and it's okay if you don't like it and if it's not for you. But know that I care about you as a person, and that I always remember this older docent once came up to me during a really busy event in the museum, and he said to me, I think what you're doing is really great for the museum. It's really great for the community, but this is no longer the place. This is no longer my place the way it used to be. And in that moment, I was not always generous in these situations because I felt attacked and things like that. But in that moment, I really heard the loss in his voice, and that he was acknowledging that he was losing something as we were making it cool for younger people or whatever, even though we kept saying, look, we still have the archives. We still have all these exhibits. I used to always say, you don't boycott a restaurant because there's some things on the menu that aren't for you. And you don't like... there'd be people who call and they'd be like, why are you doing these Friday nights? And I'd say to them, it's so interesting. Nobody who comes on Friday night is asking, why are you open Tuesdays at 2? You know, like, like we can be many things for many people.
Right. Yeah. And just a final thought on that. Positivity is pretty hard to beat.
Mm-hmm. I'm pretty fucking positive.
You're pretty fucking positive.
Yeah.
You're pretty fucking positive.
Okay.
If I came at you angry, like just purely as an athletic strategy, I think you would overwhelm me with your positivity.
My mom called me like last year, and she has terminal cancer, and she said, Nina, I'm reading about this thing called toxic positivity. I'm like, She's like, I think maybe I have it and maybe you do too. And I was like, yeah, maybe. Yeah. Like, I don't know. It seems kind of, and she's like, it seems kind of good. I'm like, yeah, it seems kind of good. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's the best pollutant out there. It's toxic, but it's better than the other ones.
Right, yeah.
That's funny. All right, final thought. What's your relationship to your writing right now? And how is that evolving right now? I'll leave that as a fairly open question and let you take it where you want.
Yeah, so, writing has always been something I loved. I heard you talk on a podcast once about like shadow careers and or like the thing that is adjacent. I truly, and maybe this makes it truly in the shadow.
The thing that you've secretly always wanted to do, right? But then never. So you're close to it, right? It's like you're the gaffer, but you've really always wanted to be an actor.
Yeah. So I think that this was so in my shadow, I had no clue I ever wanted to write a novel. But writing has always been part of my life since I was little. When I was in college, I was an engineer by day and a slam poet by night. And then when I was in museums, I ran a blog. I wrote a couple nonfiction books about museum practice. But I really, despite writing books that were successful, I would never put writer as my main thing. And so then, in 2020, my mom got terminal cancer. I quit the CEO job of this organization I'd founded that I thought was going to be the thing for me after the Ma, because all I wanted to do was take care of her. And then during that time, I was taking care of her, but I was also unlearning all of this intense relationship with like my self-worth being connected to external achievement. And, basically I remember talking to, and so one of the things I started doing was writing this murder mystery. And I was writing because my mom and I love murder mysteries. I wrote this character to be based on her. And it was just sort of a way for me to take some of my type A energy and do something. And my mom's super type A too. So it gave us something to talk about that wasn't about cancer. But I always remember, talking to a museum director friend during that time. And he's like, so what are you up to? I'm like, well, I'm making milkshakes for my mom and I'm writing this murder mystery. And there was this pause and he goes, are you writing it ironically? And Kyle, I wish I could tell you that I said, fuck you, I'm not writing ironically. Right. No, when he said that, I felt shame. I felt like, yes, it's embarrassing that I'm doing this. And so I wrote that whole first draft of that novel thinking I would never publish. I was just doing it for me and my mom. And then at the end of that, I was like, you know what? I'm really enjoying this. And I'm enjoying it as healing from all the years of CEO life to just be quiet by myself with my imagination. I was like, I'm going to try. I'm going to try and get an agent. I'm going to try and get a book deal. And then as it turned out, the book, blew up and did great. And that afforded me the opportunity to now make novel writing my main thing. And I think that now, one of the weird things that happens when you have a successful novel is that people have more opinions about what your next novel should be. And so I actually have had a couple of projects that I worked on for a long time. I never hit writer's block. I hit somebody saying to me, either can't sell that book or can't sell that's not your best second book after what you just did. And you're making a face because it feels uncomfortable to hear that. And I've heard, I've gotten advice from some writers who say, no, you should absolutely just write what you love. And then there are other writers who say, look, you get your moment, as you said, and your moment is so fleeting. And I talked to a guy who had a book that became a very, very big Netflix show. And he was like, you just, sell out as hard as you possibly can because you will not get that opportunity again. And I don't think I'm in either of those camps, but I think that I've gotten to a place where I'm like, I have to write what I love, but I also can be strategic about what should be book 2 and what should be book 3 or book 4. And so I'm writing a novel that I'm really excited about. It takes place in the Grand Canyon, and I've been spending a ton of time out there and just absolutely falling in love with the desert. And my first book, Mother, Daughter, Murder Night, takes place in Monterey Bay, and there's a lot of nature writing alongside the murder mystery. This similarly is a murder mystery happening in the Grand Canyon, and so I've just been immersing myself in the place, writing a lot. I have a rule for myself, or it depends. I'm still learning what my writing process is. I'm not a write every day person. I'm finding that sprints really work well for me. So I'll do like a 2 to 6 week period of writing a lot, and then I do a lot of editing. Editing I can do more flexibly. I feel like that's a different brain, but really the generation, I need a certain kind of focus. And then the way writing a novel works and is so different from writing copy or writing museum labels or even writing grant reports or whatever. So much writing in most jobs, even creative jobs, is very collaborative, right? The team is all getting in the document, or we're talking about ideas and then somebody's going doing it. Writing a novel, at least with a traditional publisher, is much more like running a relay race, where it's my job to get the draft as good as I possibly can, and then I hand it off to my agent or I hand it off to my editor. And then it's their job to scrutinize it as much as they possibly can and come back to me and say, hey, I think this, and this need to change. And it's really challenged my thinking about what creative collaboration looks like, because I used to think that it was always good to have everybody, all hands in the pot, kind of thing. And now I'm learning, wow, how many times did I bring a half-baked idea, not because I wanted to make sure that there was room for other people, but because I was lazy and I didn't take it as far as I could. And I feel like I'm really learning a lot about my own creative process and my own ability to work something all the way through in doing this. So anyway, I'm writing a novel. I also, because there are these gap periods where you send it off to somebody and you have to wait a few weeks, I also have been using short stories and essays as a way to play with things that on a shorter, a novel length manuscript is long. But if I'm like, I want to really work on writing a great twist, or I want to, work on how can I add an element of surprise around a particular element or a chaotic scene or something like that. I'll sometimes write a short story or an essay during one of those downtimes just to kind of work that through so I can build that back into my full-length manuscript process as well.
Right. To the point about laziness, and I've gone through this same thing where I think I'm doing my best work, and then I send it to. I had this experience last year where I sent it to a friend who's a great writer, author, and he said, go through this again and then send it back to me.
Good.
And I felt such shame, but I am so much stronger as a result of it. And yeah, I think that it's we're always changing and growing in little bits, on the inside, and figuring out how we can be strongest in our craft is such a fucking dance.
Well, and I think that there is, like, you want to talk about like overcorrections. I think when it comes to creativity, the rise of agencies and like there has been this sense of like, hey, it was not good when it was just people solo in their little office doing this thing. And there has, I think there's a real active debate in all creative practices about, TV is written in writers' rooms, movies and books are not. Like, and that's not just about medium. There's convention, there's culture there. But I'm very curious about those things because I think that, or it's just made me challenge my own biases about the sense that, putting it out there as early as possible for as many people to be part of it is a good. And even in personal communication, I notice now I have some friends who like really take their time before they will text you back, and that I can feel this impatience that, we're supposed, the way things are supposed to happen between people who are close is just like messy and free flowing. And then it's like, this person respects me enough to like give me a full answer. And just sort of checking my own biases about the idea that speed equals intelligence, or, group work equals creativity, and just some of those neural connections, I'm finding enjoyment in obliterating them.
Right. When is it really time to share it with someone, and when do you just want them to run a little more of the relay race?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Or you just want it out of your box. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. Yeah.
My secret, and I don't know if it's a secret that's working, but it's really the thing that has directed my entire life from writing to career and beyond is I share my work with people who I'm a little afraid of.
When I signed with my agent for my book, I had a few options, and I would literally say, I'm going with the agent who scares me the most, because that's a person who's going to challenge me to up my game. And I should have, how lucky are we? And I think sports do this. If you have enough confidence in yourself to make that choice, like, you will go so far with that, right?
Right. Well, I think that it's a process of looking at yourself from the outside. Like, what would be the best move for Nina right now?
Yeah.
Even if you want the instant gratification, or you want everyone to just tell you you're awesome, what would make her be the strongest writer that she can be? And it probably would be to go with an agent who makes her a little afraid.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing I'd say about my writing process these days is, I wrote the first book on my mom's bed during a time when I was going from 80-hour weeks to maybe 20-hour weeks. And then that book was a big success. And so I have not chosen to lean. I did a lot to support that book, but I'm not hustling to try and get 3 books out in the next 3 years or something. I'm like, you know what? I have been given the gift that this book has done well enough financially that I can take my time, and I can spend time backpacking in the Grand Canyon. And sure, it's research, but it's also a hell of a lot of fun. And I feel like I'm choosing a lot more joy. I'm choosing a lot more time with my friends. I'm choosing to host dinners and things like that. And I think that I'm serious and committed when I'm doing my writing, but it's not uncommon that I'm writing in the 6 to 9 a.m. period, and that is all the computer time I'm doing that day.
You got a great jean jacket onesie on top of it.
There you go.
For
I just
people
got
who
this
aren't watching, that
yesterday
thing's gangster.
Thank you. I got it at the thrift store yesterday, and I wore it to volleyball, and I was like, I think I could just wear this.
Yeah. I know. And for really, I think the first time maybe meeting each other, I'm like, this is really making a good impression.
All
She'll
right.
always be in the jean jacket onesie from now on.
Excellent. No, I'm going to Arizona to see a friend tomorrow, and I called him yesterday, and I was just like, I just got this thing. I don't think I'm taking it off.
No,
I think I'm going to be wearing it off the plane. Yeah.
Highly recommended. Nina Simon, this was such a blast. Where's the best place for people to find your book, get in touch with you, and beyond?
Yeah. Well, as you said in the beginning, I am named after somebody very famous. So online, I use Nina K. Simon. So you can find me on Instagram there or at ninaksimon.com. The book is called Mother, Daughter, Murder Night. And it's a great, if you need to get a gift for a woman in your life, it could be a mom woman, but it could be like a girlfriend woman. It's great on audio as well. But it's definitely strong women, dead bodies, wild places, and a lot of fun.
So much fun. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you.